Following a migration from the far-off Amazon that lasted several thousand years, the Taino, Arawak, and Carib Indians had populated all of the Antilles by the time the caravels of Christopher Columbus arrived at the end of the 15th century. The Spanish colonized mainly the Greater Antilles, composed of the islands of Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. Once the Indian resistance had been repressed, these islands served as departure points for the expeditions of Cortés to Mexico and Pizarro to Peru. Within a few years, the capitals had been founded: San Juan of Puerto Rico, Havana, and Santo Domingo. The Spanish were the uncontested masters of the New World. The lands that they had conquered were so vast, so rich, that they didn't bother with the minor islands of the Lesser Antilles. These were the islands that the English, the French, and the Dutch, who embarked upon their colonial adventures much later, would fight over. Gradually, a tropical Europe took form in the heart of the Caribbean Sea. For centuries, sailing ships, then the early steamers, would travel from Seville to Cuba, from London to the Barbados, from Nantes to Martinique, but there were no maritime routes connecting the islands within the Caribbean. We've sailed from Florida to the archipelago of Les Saintes. Now we'll continue our Transcaribbean voyage. Our final destination is Trinidad. We're on board the Star Clipper, a four-master in the olden style. We're headed towards Guadeloupe with a few other passengers. We've got a fairly stiff wind and a choppy sea, but the vista is breathtaking. The captain has decided to drop anchor just off Dole, a small fishing village on the leeward side of Guadeloupe. Far from the island's more touristy zones, Dole has managed to keep a certain authenticity and a tranquil atmosphere. Monsieur Isambert never misses the practice sessions of these young villagers who are striving to maintain the old-time sailing traditions. In his day, sailing wasn't a leisure activity. Far from it.
The boats were 23 meters long and 4 meters wide. Back then, they didn't use the lateen sails, just the square sails. They would transport coal and lumber and passengers from Basse-Terre and Dole, and they would bring back merchandise to stock the shops. And then there was the Second World War. After the war, cars started to come in here. And little by little, they replaced the cargo boats. That's when I stopped, and I became a fisherman. My boat was called Les Efforts. It was my father's boat. I started when I was 16. They took me on at 16. My father was captain, and he took me on as a seaman.
Whereas in Dole, there's still some of the atmosphere of the olden days, in Pointe Pitre, things have evolved much quicker. The port where the schooners used to dock is now home to the powerful high-speed catamarans that go from Guadeloupe to the outlying islands, Les Saintes, Marie-Galante, and La Désirade. There are, however, still some pockets where the traditions hang on, like here in the market, a spot where the authentic Guadeloupean life abounds. Here you can meet tourists in the market for fruit and spices, but also the locals who are out doing their everyday shopping.
Mesdames, messieurs, mesdemoiselles, approchez de bonne affaire. Homme seul, femme seule, homme isolé, femme isolée. Parce que monsieur qui n'y madame en dehors, madame qui n'y monsieur en dehors, pied d'air, bonjour. Voilà, Jovan, madame. Jovan.
The cemetery in Morne-à-l'Eau, perched on a hillside with its tombs covered in black and white tiles, is another place where the memory of Guadeloupe lives on. Meet Dolores, whose main ambition is to maintain the thread of the traditions and transmit them to the younger generations. But to maintain the traditions, one has to first understand them.
Our traditions are very much alive here in Guadeloupe. From generation to generation, we realize that the young people are defending the traditions. Now you have the funeral homes, of course, but normally we kept the deceased person in the home for 2 days and we would hold a wake. Each family would come in with candles, coffee, rum and soup, and a meal. And we'd spend the night with the deceased, among family, with friends and neighbors. After the burial, it was good to gather at the house once again for 9 nights of prayer and Veneration Day, which was something like the wake. The women dressed in mourning for 2 years for their mother and 1 year for their husband.
Even though the traditions express the diversity of the Caribbean islands, they've often evolved from the same sources: colonization and slavery. Of all the Guadeloupean traditions, Dolores' favorite is the cockpit, the arena where the cockfights take place. She's set up a pit in her own home, along with a little museum, and she takes visitors on guided tours on fight evenings.
Once we've weighed the cocks, we move on matching the adversaries. Same weight and same value. In the French Antilles, cockfighting is not to the death. These birds are top athletes, and we train them for fighting for 6 or 7 years. They can live for up to 14 or 15 years.
C'est la nuit, il ne voit pas parce qu'il faut qu'il cherche.
Every island in the Caribbean has its own particularities. For example, the quadrille dance is totally different from one island to the next. Even here in Guadeloupe, there are differences. In Grande Terre, they dance the quadrille with a collar, but not in Basse Terre. The quadrille comes from Italy, but each island has modified it in its own way. There are French, Spanish, and English influences, and we try to make a blend of all that, a sort of melting pot. As I said, this island has the culture of 5 continents, and it's small to take all that in, but it's important.
Looking at a political map of the Caribbean is enough to make you dizzy. There are so many very small independent countries. This mosaic had its practical side during World War II. What was the situation at the time? In 1940, the French, who refused defeat and the Vichy government, fled to London. Here, for the Guadeloupean patriots, London was the neighboring island of Dominica, then an English colony. Barthélemy Pinault was one of those men, one of the dissidents as they were called then. It was here from the Capesterre beach in southern Guadeloupe that he left more than 60 years ago. For him, it seems like yesterday.
Well, I was scared. But since I had to give the example, I said to myself, I'm the leader, I'll take them to Dominica. I said to them, listen, we're leaving for Dominica. We're leaving as dissidents. We were hiding here in this spot because they were informers. They'd go say, you know, there are some guys that are going to leave from Capesterre. And then we saw the boat coming in, and it landed. The skipper asked us if we had the money. I said yes, and I gave him the money. It was all there. We headed out for Dominica, and then, in the middle of the night, we were spotted by the searchlights of the patrol boat Jeanne. The skipper lowered the sail right away and he said, here, take this line. If they come up to you, you tell them we're fishing. It was foggy and we couldn't see very well because we used to navigate by sight. We eventually made it to St. Joseph, and that's where we landed. The police came and got us and took us off in the wagons to the police station at Roseau. The political situation was unfair because we were profoundly French. Among ourselves, we would say that we were a lot more French than the Alsatians and Lorraines.
Our voyage across the Caribbean now takes us to Martinique. What did Martinique represent for the French colonists of the 17th century? A lost island at the far ends of the earth? A land with a climate favorable for sugarcane plantations? Whereas for the colonists, the sea symbolized the link that kept them in touch with France, for the African slaves, uprooted from their homeland, the sea had a completely different sense.
The Caribbean has always been a closed sea. It's important to note that unlike the coastal dwellers of the Mediterranean, who enjoyed the freedom of their space, voyages, a form of escape, for the early colonists here, and of course for the slaves, the Caribbean Sea represented an enclosure, a boundary to prevent them from returning to their point of departure. There was also the separation between the different colonists, the Spanish, the English, the French, who were at war with each other. So in a way, everyone was hunkered down in their own island. And it's true that back then the people were mainly turned toward the land, meaning the plantations. Even today, you can notice that there are not an awful lot of maritime exchanges between the different islands of the Caribbean that, of course, have the same populations but have very different colonial pasts.
Times have changed. The descendants of the early slaves eventually tamed their fears of the sea. On the beach of Le Diamant, a center of Martinique's colonial history, the gumboat races always attract an enthusiastic crowd of spectators. The sea, the pleasant climate, the music, the Creole language are all stereotypes used to depict Martinique. Rum, on the other hand, has its own special status. It has taken several centuries for the Martiniquais to give it the importance it deserves in their island's heritage.
Each one has his own interpretation and his own history with rum, since rum was born from the confrontation between the Europeans and the Africans with the whole slavery-based system that we know. The Europeans have the image of the pirate, the privateer, the freebooter, the buccaneer of the open sea of the Caribbean. Whereas the Africans, the descendants of the slaves, rum evokes poorly paid work, suffering, despair. Depending on whether one is on the European side or the African side, it's not the same vision of this common history that is rum. It's only now, little by little, as people's minds are becoming decolonized, that we're beginning to accept what is truly a culture, a custom.
We're leaving Martinique and heading for Kingstown, capital of the country that since 1979 has been composed of the island of St. Vincent and the Grenadine Islands. St. Vincent all by itself resumes the whole history of the Lesser Antilles. All the protagonists are there on the program. Christopher Columbus, who landed on the island in 1498 and gave it its name. The Carib Indians, who were there resisting colonization. The French and the English, who took turns occupying the island. And also the slaves, brought over from Africa to work the sugarcane. We have to add the black Caribs to this list. They were runaway slaves who intermarried with the Indians and formed a new ethnic group. These black Caribs, also called Garifuna, held out for a long time against the English before being conquered in 1796 and deported to the Honduras. Like all its neighbors in the Antilles, St. Vincent is oriented towards tourism. In the last few years, this gateway to the Grenadine Islands has become a favorite destination for pleasure boating. At the Blue Lagoon Marina, on the southern end of the island, we board a sailboat to pursue our route across the Caribbean. Dexter is our skipper. He'll be taking us further south to the island of Cariaco, where another boat is waiting for us. But for now, our course is in the direction of Bequia.
Going to Admiralty Bay, Bequia, 8 miles from here. And it's the home of sailors and whalers. Most people they sail, make a living by sailing. So now I raised this main sail here. So now we have the main up, we're gonna go sailing down to Bequia. Sailing time is 1 hour. Ferry from Bequia to St. Vincent, and I have ferry from St. Vincent all the way down to Union Island. And I go like 4 times a week. 400 passenger ferry.
Bequia is only 18 square kilometers, yet it is the largest of the Grenadine Islands. Its population is the result of a curious mixture of the African slaves and former colonists of Scottish origin, and then later in the 19th century, American whalers from New Bedford. It was they who began the island's whaling tradition.
We are preparing the boat to go out, and we'll be going out the second week in February. The whale come around by the moon, you know. Most quarter moon and first quarter, last quarter, the whale come around. My great-grandfather, he lived until he was 103. And he uses the whale on the Yankee whaling ship in New Bedford, Nantucket, New England, those places. And then my grandfather also whale with the Yankee whalers. And my father he whale with those older whalers. And then it's in my blood, you know, whale is in my blood.
See, in my father days, they used to catch any amount of whale, but now they give them a certain amount to catch around here. Sometimes they say they give them to catch 2. And now I understand they're giving them chance now to get 3. Very dangerous, very dangerous. No engine, no nothing at all, just the rowboats, sailing boats, the sail and the rope. See, sometimes when you strike those whales and they come when they're dying, it is going very bad, you know. They just come to the boat and try to fight the boat. Very dangerous. Very dangerous, very dangerous.
You see, anytime we get close to a whale, to harpoon it, I just feel good. Because I know there will be food for everybody, and there will be medicine for everybody, and the expectation will be really high. Because when we harpoon a whale, you know, the whole country just go crazy. It's a carnival thing, you know. Because everybody, they want the whale meat so much. They want the oil so much. The bones, we take them to make seats and so on. The only thing that is waste on the whale is the intestine.
In the morning, we leave Bequia, heading for the Tobago Keys, a series of 5 small islands lost in the middle of a turquoise sea. Tobago has become one of the most popular mooring spots of the Grenadines. There are no hotels anywhere on this paradise where the wealthy tourists never stay more than a day or 2. So then what do the islanders live on?
Well, then do the solely fish and the lobster to the charter boats. That's why they make a living here. There's not much employment going on in the small islands. Most people around here, look, girls who just come to school, they sell the marijuana, sell the drugs, and that's what they're living. Some fish, some selling drugs, because there's no patrol here. Like for instance, like Tobago Keys, if they come and do something here, somebody will get a job. Most people go to America and England for work.
We sail out of the Tobago Keys and make for Union Island, about 10 miles south. Up until the 19th century, Union Island was cultivated by English and Scots colonists. At the time, crops covered a good part of the island. Then, it was all abandoned. In spite of appearances, Union Island's economy, like the rest of the Grenadines, is based on tourism. Tourism and fishing. There's a certain activity in the Port of Union as it emerges from the dawn's dim glow. But there's no sign of big fishing boats, nor are there any fishermen mending their nets. Only the colorfully painted outboards lined up along the shore. But what type of fishing are they getting ready for?
My profession of fishing is scuba dive, lobsters and conch. All right, I don't use the line fishing, the line. I use the tanks, yeah, and I go down and do the diving. So I select whatever I need. Right? So these I use for catching the lobsters. Yeah. But for the past year or so, since we have the weather, the hurricane, yeah, we have a slight problem. They destroy the bottom, mash up the reefs, so there is a problem in catching the lobsters right now on the conch. Yeah. With the Royal Caribbean, I went out, you know, doing pool attendant. Yeah, but then since I went out there, the money was too small. The last company I was with here, I was in Hawaii, but I was out before 3 years before. I was in Central America, Alaska, and Europe. Of course, I prefer to live here because what I'm making here per week is what they want to pay me there per month.
We've sighted Carriacou. There's nothing to distinguish this island from all the others we've just visited, and yet we're no longer in the Grenadines, we're in Grenada. It's time to say goodbye to Dexter and his catamaran. At the end of a jetty, another boat is awaiting us. L'Adélaïde, a wooden schooner that does a cargo run twice a week between Carriacou and St. George's, the capital of Grenada. The Caribbean used to be full of schooners. These solid vessels, called goélettes in the French Antilles, were all-purpose cargo ships. They were also used to transport passengers, plying along the coasts back before there were any roads on the islands. L'Adélaïde is probably one of the last schooners still in service in the Caribbean. But judging from the small amount of cargo it's carrying, there's no telling how long it will stay in business.
Well, a schooner is a locally built boat, right? It's built out of cedar wood and plank up with pitch pine. Used to plank up, right? But it's built with locally cedar wood from Grenada. Yeah, it built 1984. People stopped building this type of wooden schooner now. Well, apparently, you see, they usually, long time there was building for jogging cargo and so, and all the cargo now shipping by container ship, you know? So that's slow down the trade for them.
After 4 hours of sailing, we arrive at St. George's, the capital of Grenada. L'Adélaïde slows down to enter the port of Carénage. This natural harbor, surrounded by the old warehouses, is one of the most picturesque in the Caribbean. The old schooners may no longer be here taking on spices, the island's main resources like in the olden days, but Carénage still has an incredible amount of charm.
It goes way back in 1939 when it was first built. Actually, the Carénage itself is an extinct volcanic crater. Grenada as a whole is a volcanic island, so there are volcanic lakes around the island. But this port was developed from a schooner facility to a present dual type facility, meaning we have cargo vessels, schooner ships, and of course the cruise ships.
Up until quite recently, the port was bustling with activity. Schooners, freighters, ferries, and even cruise ships. But faced with the size and number of cruise ships seeking to dock at St. George's, the authorities had to build a full-fledged cruise ship terminal.
And we've seen that evolution here at Port St. George as we've moved from a situation where we concentrated on simply trading fruits and vegetables between Grenada and the other islands of the Caribbean to the point where we have ships now coming out of Miami, coming out of Europe.
Situated in the heart of the old town, the St. George's Market is still a colorful and animated show. But most of the spice vendors have left the market and set up their stands right in front of the cruise ship terminal. After the abolition of slavery, many plantations went into decline. The estates were cut up, and the smaller landowners started raising new crops. That's how Grenada became the Spice Island.
Some of these spices we do export with it. We export the nutmegs. The association send this away to the different places throughout the world. The cinnamon, we ship to Trinidad, plus people take it wherever they want to go with it, and they do whatever they want to do with it.
The beauty of Grenada. It's not only its beach-lined shores fringed with coconut trees, there is also the interior. Grenada is of volcanic origin, and its center is covered with an incredibly diverse tropical forest. The spices grow in the midst of this lush vegetation. The most abundant is nutmeg. Here, the workers of Guyave are sorting the nuts. But Guyave is above all a fishing village, a small provincial town without any particular charm, but infused, if not with happiness, then certainly with tranquility. Guyave is permeated with an atmosphere of days gone by. The men gather in front of the village's only bar. The television is on, but they're not really watching it. The children are playing on the beach. But in spite of this apparent tranquility, their life is difficult.
Do fishing for our living. That's we strike with everything we have is when you see. So it is now, we're on a strike now. We don't fish, we don't walk. When it cool down, we go back to work again. And we feel that's what we live. To mind our children, our wife, our everything. That's what we live by, the sea, not the government.
After 4 weeks of sailing through the Caribbean, we've arrived in Trinidad, a stone's throw from South America. Trinidad, only 12 kilometers from the coast of Venezuela, used to be attached to the continent, which made it an important stepping stone to populating the Caribbean.
We think that the first people to live in Trinidad came maybe about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. And certainly they came from the large area in South America between the rivers Amazon and Orinoco, that huge area which is now made up of 5 or 6 different nations in Latin America. So as waves of migrants came from that area of northern South America, they used the islands as stepping stones. They were good seafarers, but they didn't have the technology for long distance ocean voyages. So they basically hopped from island to island.
This blackish expanse is the Pitch Lake. Beneath its crusty surface lies one of the world's few natural asphalt deposits. It probably would have remained unknown for a long time if it hadn't been for a famous English pirate who landed here at the end of the 16th century.
The lake is a mixture of mud, oil, and water. But it was near the seacoast, that's 3/4 miles from here. That is where the Amerindians had settled. But they knew it was there long before Sir Walter Raleigh came. So Sir Walter Raleigh rediscovered it when he was going to El Dorado in search of gold. So the Amerindians had helped Sir Walter Raleigh to caulk his ship, and that is when they used it in caulking Sir Walter Raleigh's ship in the year 1595.
Since the latter half of the 19th century, they've been extracting thousands of tons of asphalt every year, and the lake shows no sign of giving out. You have to admit that its size is impressive, 40 kilometers wide and 80 meters deep. Trinidad and the other Caribbean islands share the same turbulent history, dotted with wars between the French, the English, and the Spanish. However, what makes Trinidad different from its neighbors is its population mix. A stroll through the streets of Port of Spain, the island's bustling capital, and this difference becomes obvious.
The great majority of our population today are descended from people who came here enslaved, either directly from Africa on the transatlantic slave trade, or in many cases they came here from places like Martinique, Guadeloupe, Grenada, Haiti, coming with their owners who were French planters. Then after slavery was abolished, the British allowed contract, or we call it indentured immigration from India. So today the population of Trinidad is roughly 40% African, descended from Africa, some are mixed race, about 40% descended from the immigrants from India, and that leaves the remaining 20% who are mixed, and so we really have one of the most ethnically diverse populations in the world.
There's another feature that distinguishes Trinidad from the rest of the Antilles. It doesn't need tourism to live. Like its neighbor Venezuela, it has been blessed with abundant oil deposits. Yet what Trinidad does have in common with the rest of the Caribbean is music. There's calypso and soca. But Trinidad is above all where, at the beginning of the 20th century, the steel bands were born.
Well, the steel band music is an indigenous art form in this country of Trinidad and Tobago. The music was born here in Trinidad and Tobago, and mainly from the Trinidad African man. Notwithstanding that he had some assistance from a couple of East Indian guys in the 1930s. The instrument actually was made from the steel drum, which were used to bring oil in the country. So we call them oil drums. They use that for the oil, the petrochemical people and so on. But all the various music in the Caribbean, we have East Indian music, which came from the Indians who came as indentured laborers, and they brought their culture and their music. And that is still there, present in Trinidad and in Guyana, because Guyana is also a place where there's a lot of East Indians. And the other music, African music, we have African drumming and so on like that, you know. And we love each other's music.
I'll be doing it over and over and over. From the very first crescendo, it has to come out. Everybody has to go down very soft and come out. Come now, man.
Have the tenor pan, which is a voice. He's a singer. He represents the singer. Then we have the double seconds, which represents the alto. Pans, which will represent the bass guitars. And over the years, our pan tuners and pan makers have innovated and made other instruments out of the steel pan. Like for instance, we have a quadraphonic, which is 4 sets of pans, which represents the alto. Then we have 9 basses, 12 basses. So the pan is always emerging and going forward all the time. How football is like a religion in Brazil, the steel pan is like a religion in Trinidad and Tobago. It is like reggae in Jamaica. That is how the steel band music is. It is out of this world. Once you get involved into the steel band, you can't get away. It's like an addiction.
But the vista is breathtaking. The captain has decided to drop anchor just off Dole, a small fishing village on the leeward side of Guadeloupe. Far from the island's more touristy zones, Dole has managed to keep a certain authenticity and a tranquil atmosphere.
My boat was called Les Efforts. It was my father's boat. I started when I was 16. They took me on at 16. My father was captain and he took me on as a seaman.
Whereas in Dole, there's still some of the atmosphere of the olden days, in Pointe Pitre, things have evolved much quicker. The port where the schooners used to dock is now home to the powerful high-speed catamarans that go from Guadeloupe to the outlying islands, Les Saintes, Marie-Galante, and La Désirade. There are, however, still some pockets where the traditions hang on, like here in the market, a spot where the authentic Guadeloupean life abounds. Here you can meet tourists in the market for fruit and spices, but also the locals who are out doing. Monsieur Isambert never misses the practice sessions of these young villagers who are striving to maintain the old-time sailing traditions. In his day, sailing wasn't a leisure activity. Far from it.
The boats were 23 meters long and 4 meters wide. Back then, they didn't use the lateen sails, just the square sails. They would transport coal and lumber and passengers from Pitre and Dole, and they would bring back merchandise to stock the shops. And then there was the Second World War. After the war, cars started to come in here. And little by little, they replaced the cargo boats. That's when I stopped, and I became a fisherman.
So rich that they didn't bother with the minor islands of the Lesser Antilles. These were the islands that the English, the French, and the Dutch, who embarked upon their colonial adventures much later, would fight over. Gradually, a tropical Europe took form in the heart of the Caribbean Sea. For centuries, sailing ships, then the early steamers would travel from Seville to Cuba, from London to the Barbados, from Nantes to Martinique, but there were no maritime routes connecting the islands within the Caribbean. We've sailed from Florida to the archipelago of Les Saintes. Now we'll continue our Transcaribbean voyage. Our final destination is Trinidad. We're on board the Star Clipper, a four-master in the olden style. We're headed towards Guadeloupe with a few other passengers. We've got a fairly stiff wind and a choppy sea. Following a migration from the far-off Amazon that lasted several thousand years, the Taino, Arawak, and Carib Indians had populated all of the Antilles by the time the caravels of Christopher Columbus arrived at the end of the 15th century. The Spanish colonized mainly the Greater Antilles, composed of the islands of Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. Once the Indian resistance had been repressed, these islands served as departure points for the expeditions of Cortes to Mexico and Pizarro to Peru. Within a few years, the capitals had been founded: San Juan of Puerto Rico, Havana, and Santo Domingo. The Spanish were the uncontested masters of the New World. The lands that they had conquered were so vast, so